All right, thank you guys so much for coming. And for those of you tuning in online, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to Emily Farr. She is a Knauss Fellow in the NMFS Office of Habitat Conservation currently. She holds a Master's of Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and a Master's in Food Studies from the University of Gastronomic Sciences. So talk to her about food. This talk will focus on research she conducted as a research fellow with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And it's entitled, How Do Fishermen Understand the Ecosystem? Local Ecological Knowledge in Maine's Commercial Fisheries. All right, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Bridget. So as Bridget said, I'm going to be talking about a project that I was working on up in eastern Maine at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, looking at the local ecological knowledge of commercial fishermen. Maybe. Yep, it's on. There we go. Okay. So before I dive into the project, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit and tell you about why we decided to work on this project. So the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is a nonprofit that really focuses on collaboration between fishermen's knowledge and science, as well as constructive and creative engagement of fishermen's voices in the management dialogue. And so there's a lot of momentum right now in eastern Maine in thinking about moving towards ecosystem-based fisheries management at a small pilot scale. And the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is really invested in making sure that the voices and knowledge of fishermen are involved in that process. And so this project was kind of an opportunity to start to begin to explore that knowledge in eastern Maine and how it can be integrated into that process. And then the second piece, which I'll be talking a lot about in the next 20 minutes, is fisheries access and licensing. So the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries also has a mission to ensure that eastern Maine is a place where communities can fish forever. And part of that means diversified access to fisheries so those fishermen can adapt to a changing social and ecological landscape. And so I'll talk a lot more about access, but the idea behind this project was if we want to understand kind of how the knowledge of fishermen can contribute to ecosystem-based fisheries management, we need to understand how management is shaping or contributing to that knowledge. And we hypothesized that access is a key mechanism in shaping that knowledge. So what is local ecological knowledge, which I'll probably refer to as LEK because it's a lot easier to say. It is a form of experiential information about the natural environment accumulated by interacting with it on a regular basis, and it's often fine-scale, continuous, and transmitted either between generations or socially. And so in this case, it's really the knowledge that fishermen accumulate by fishing. So there's a long history of research about how fishermen's knowledge can and has contributed to more effective fisheries management and really provided a complement to scientific information. So the first piece is that the knowledge of fishermen is often pretty fine scale. They are out on the water on a regular basis and they see processes and changes and relationships in their fishing grounds in the areas where they're fishing. And that can help us kind of tune management to those fine scales and really understand what's going on. The second piece, like I just mentioned, is ecosystem-based fisheries management. Again, fishermen are able to, they're not just seeing the species they're targeting, they're seeing interactions between different species in their environment. And so they can help us with this shift towards more holistic management that doesn't just look at single species in isolation. And then the final piece is change. So fishermen can provide a lot of environmental history and information about long-term trends and environmental changes, which can help both with research on climate change and formulating kind of the right research questions to ask, and also thinking about strategies for adaptation of our management systems. So that's this first piece of this triangle that I'm going to talk about, which I the whole thing in the previous slide. So this kind of is what I'm going to talk about the rest of the talk, is this relationship between local knowledge feeding into fisheries management. How does fisheries management shape access to fisheries, and then how does that in turn shape knowledge? So that's local knowledge feeding into fisheries management. So looking at the second piece of the triangle, how fisheries management kind of determines access to fisheries. which is really who can fish where, when, how often, and for what. So we were working in the context of Eastern Maine, and there's been a lot of specialization in the Maine fishing fleet, like there has been in a lot of places in the past few decades. People used to fish seasonally and switch between a lot of different species over the course of the year. And now many fishermen are just fishing for one thing, and that's largely lobster in Eastern Maine. And that's partly because lobsters are currently really abundant and profitable, but it's also partly because the licenses or permits to fish for other species have gotten more difficult to obtain once given up, or a lot harder to get as a new fisher entering the fishing landscape. So the majority of fishermen in Maine rely on state fisheries, again with lobster being the most common, followed by shellfish and marine worm. And some are in the federal lobster fishery. But in the state context, which is what this figure here is describing, it is the evolution of the licensing system in Maine from 1977 to the present. And so really what this is showing is that in 1977, there were 5 licenses that allowed you to fish for a variety of different species, participate in different fisheries under each license. And over the course of the last several decades, there's been this splintering of licenses whereby each license allows you to fish for a very specific thing. So for example, if you look at this blue one in the middle here, while once you were able to fish for shellfish, surf clam, mussel, and mahogany clam all with one license, you now need individual licenses to fish for each of those things. So in fact, access to state fisheries has declined over 50% in the last 25 years. And today, 66% of fishermen hold only one license, and it's hard to obtain new licenses in that landscape. And so this has pretty significant implications for the resilience of those fishermen to change in the system. And this diagram is from a paper by Josh Stoll, who I worked closely with on this project. In the federal context, there was a lot of historic participation in groundfish in Eastern Maine, but a changing federal fishery landscape and kind of a shift in the groundfish fleet towards a catch share quota-based system made it pretty hard for Maine fishermen to retain access to those fisheries. So again, those fishermen had pretty small diversified operations with low landings, and they often underreported their landings data. And so when there was a shift towards an allocation that was based on catch history, they weren't able to demonstrate that history. And so a lot of those fishermen no longer have access to groundfish. So in general, there's been this consolidation or this constraining of access and declining access in the Maine landscape. Okay. So looking at this third side of the triangle, which is really what we wanted to explore with this project, understanding how this access to fisheries shapes the knowledge of fishermen and what that means for management. So obviously not all fishermen's knowledge is the same. It's geographically limited, it's unevenly distributed between individual fishermen, and it's constrained by the social context, such as the management institutions and technological and social context. And so we wanted to know, what is it that is really driving variability in the knowledge of fishermen in Eastern Maine, and what role does fisheries access play in that picture? So the questions we were asking were, first, what types of knowledge do fishermen have about the ecosystem? What are they observing when they're out on the water? How does that knowledge vary between individual fishermen based on different interactions with the ecosystem? And here we were really looking at participation in fisheries as that differing interaction. And finally, how do management structures, particularly those that are dictating access to fisheries, shape variability in that knowledge? So this is the geographic area we were working in. In Eastern Maine, Hancock and Washington counties are 2 really highly fisheries dependent counties in the US. And fishing really plays an important role in the economic and social fabric of the area. So it was a good place to be thinking about fishermen's knowledge and what it means. So what did we do? We interviewed 17 commercial fishermen in 12 different harbors who ranged in age from 25 to 71 years and participated in between 1 to 9 fisheries. And in total, that covered 18 different fisheries. And we really wanted to understand the kind of interactions and relationships that fishermen were observing. So we asked them about the preferred habitat of the species they were targeting, the ecological and biophysical parameters that affected those species, the food web relationships, and environmental and socioeconomic change that they've observed. And all of those interviews were recorded and transcribed and coded kind of based on the themes that emerged from the interviews to kind of organize that information. And so to kind of show you how we organized the information and that fishermen were describing and what it looked like, there were 4 really primary categories of information that we identified. And the radius of the circle is indicating kind of how many times that type of information was described. So the most common thing that fishermen talked about was ecosystem structure, which is referring to kind of the abiotic and biotic components of the ecosystem and how they fit together. So that included things like bottom type, water temperature, food web relationships, current patterns, tides. So one example is a lot of fishermen talked about which bottom type was preferred by different species. The second most common category was ecosystem dynamics, and that was really more the processes in the ecosystem that fishermen were observing. And so that included things like the drivers of abundance and distribution of different species, their behavior. And so as an example, fishermen talked about descriptions of seasonal lobster movement or migration along the bottom. The third category is social context, and so that included things like technological change, markets, sources of knowledge, social change. And so a lot of fishermen described how they accumulated the information that they were talking about. And so a lot said they learned from older fishermen in previous generations. And then the final category was environmental change, which really overlaps with all of the others, but included a lot of information about water temperature, changing fishing patterns. The most common thing people talked about were changes in various spatial distributions of species over time and why they thought that was happening. Okay, so we wanted to be able to more systematically look at individual knowledge and collective knowledge and analyze kind of the variability among the fishermen that we were talking to. So we decided to construct cognitive maps for each interview based on the information that the fishermen were describing. And so cognitive maps are really just qualitative models of a system composed of variables or nodes and the relationships between those nodes or edges. And they can be used to produce a graphical representation of knowledge, which is a type of network. And so in this case, the nodes are these ecosystem components or characteristics, so things like water temperature or scallops. And the edges are the relationships between those nodes. And so we identified 4 kind of primary relationships that really encompass most of the things that fishermen were talking about. The first is drivers of species abundance or distribution. As an example, a lot of fishermen talked about how water temperature is driving lobster movement. Species behavior, which included things like lobsters molt when the water warms. So that would be water temperature is driving lobster molting. System health, which encompassed information like nutrient content and how that's important for the size of different species and their growth rates. And then food web relationships, so what's eating what. And so we analyzed all of those maps using a network approach that allowed us to make kind of comparisons between individuals based on the structure of those cognitive maps they described. So I want to walk you through an example just to show you kind of how we got from this textual interview information to these cognitive maps. So in this case, I asked this fisherman, how do you decide where to set your lobster traps? And he said, when you have the deep sea jellyfish start chasing plankton up in May and June, water columns are getting warmer. When that starts happening, lobsters start migrating north. Another telltale water temperature indicator is when the migratory bird offspring cluster up and start to swim around this island. The lobsters are generally right at the head of the bay. So what I hear from that is that jellyfish are eating plankton, so that's a red food web relationship. Water temperature is important for the lobster, jellyfish, and bird movement, so that's a species behavior relationship. And water temperature is important for the distribution of lobster on the bottom, so that's a species abundance or distribution relationship. And so we did this for really every interaction relationship described by all 17 fishermen that we interviewed. So this is just 2 examples of 2 fishermen and their cognitive maps scaled up from all the relationships that they described. And here I want to draw your attention to the difference in participation of these two fishermen. So the fisherman on the right, or on the left, has only ever participated in the lobster fishery, and the fisherman on the right has participated in 7 fisheries over the course of his lifetime. And there's obviously a lot of other differences between them: age, geography, length of experience, but I want to pay attention to the diversification piece for now. And you can see really just the complexity and the number of relationships described by the diversified fisherman is a lot greater than the lobsterman. The lobsterman was able to describe kind of how lobsters interact with their physical environment and what they're eating, and the diversified fisherman talked about how all these different species interact with each other, and how, kind of what the causal relationships in the ecosystem looked like. And so when we plotted participation, so how many fisheries has an individual participated in over the course of their time fishing, against against the size of their network, which includes both the number of components in the ecosystem they described, as well as the number of relationships they described, there was a statistically significant relationship between them. So diversified fishermen had larger networks, were able to describe more of the ecosystem. And interestingly, they also had more complex networks, which is another measure of the structure of a network, which indicates kind of the causality in a system. And so diversified fishermen were able to better describe these causal processes than were the more specialized fishermen. So this is the cognitive map or network from all 17 interviews. And I mostly want to put it up here because it's just a really amazing amount of information. This is 17 people. I talked to each one for no more than an hour and a half or 2 hours, and they described 229 components of the ecosystem and 635 different relationships, unique relationships between them. And so this table here is just showing what the most common relationships were. You'll notice that they all involve lobster because 12 of the 17 fishermen I talked to participate in the lobster fishery. So this is obviously not representative of all fishermen's knowledge in eastern Maine, but just kind of a starting point of what that variability looks like. So just to kind of parse out what some of this means, the most common relationship was water temperature is important for the abundance or distribution of lobster. And so the width of each line is the number of fishermen that describe that relationship. So here is lobster, and here is water temperature, and that purple line is that relationship between them. The second most common was cod eats lobster. And so again, here that's lobster, and this is cod, and that's that food web relationship between them. And the point here is really that the aggregation of knowledge of these 17 individuals is way greater than any individual's understanding of the ecosystem. So just to conclude, the collective body of fishermen's local ecological knowledge can really complement scientific information about ecosystem dynamics and changes at multiple scales. The fishermen I talked to described broad climate patterns, changes in the Gulf Stream, all the way down to really specific observations in particular mudflats. And I think that that is of particular relevance in thinking about ecosystem-based fisheries management and kind of nested scales of management. As regulatory measures in fisheries management increasingly constrain the ability of these individuals to enter diverse fisheries, the diversity and scope of their knowledge is also constrained. And I think as is their capacity to engage in management. So, if you are not able to observe a lot of relationships in the ecosystem, you're less able to really meaningfully contribute to management of that ecosystem. So we need to pay closer attention to institutions that shape the production of ecological knowledge if we're to move towards a more participatory ecosystem-based approach to managing fisheries. And then finally, I think it's important to understand how management shapes knowledge in order to determine really who to engage on what topics. So we obviously, as managers, have really limited resources and time, and so figuring out who can provide what kind of information is really important to understand. And so with that, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah. In this case, I didn't. I spent some time interviewing fishermen in Italy in a prior. Sorry. The question was wondering if I looked into the published literature to see if any of the information fishermen were describing was absent in that literature. So I was in a prior work a number of years ago, I was talking to some fishermen in Italy about their observations of climate change, and I did a lot of work looking into the literature and seeing kind of comparisons, and similar to this project, mostly the difference is scale, I think. Fishermen are describing things at a really different scale than scientific assessments are picking up. So fishermen that I talked to in one cove or bay were seeing the opposite thing that fishermen were seeing in another cove or bay because things were happening later or the currents were different or things like that. So really that fine scale is not represented, I think.
Anybody else? So thank you. That was really very interesting talk. So going to scale, how do you scale up this kind of very fine knowledge to state or national based, management practices? I'm sure that's a $1 question.
That's tricky. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's about scaling up as it is about tailoring management to the appropriate scale. So obviously this was really time intensive, but just recognizing that processes are occurring at a scale that maybe management is not accounting for. So it's, less about scaling up the knowledge, I think, and more about scaling down the management in certain contexts. Yeah.
Just a follow-up to that, then, I was wondering if you ever looked at anything that either the management council or more localized management is doing that kind of reflects like the information that you found. Is there any connection? Like, are they incorporating this knowledge at all?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, the question was whether I looked at kind of the fishery management councils or other management arenas that might be incorporating some of this knowledge. So I think in the Fishery Management Council, like the New England Council, is not operating at a scale to account for the kind of information specifically I was talking to fishermen about. But I think in the state of Maine, there are a number of management bodies that are made up of fishermen that are really incorporating. So the lobster fishery has lobster advisory councils that are industry members. The scallop fishery has a system of rotational management that involves a lot of industry members in that process. And so in those arenas, their knowledge is being incorporated.
We have a few questions online, and I'm going to hop back and forth between online and in the room. We have Steve online wants to know, do you have any experiences where Fisher's LEK contradicts scientific observations? What do you do in that situation?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So I'm in kind of a funny situation where I feel like most of my ecological knowledge about the ecosystem is from fishermen because that's mostly what I've done. That said, I think there's certainly times when fishermen will say something that is totally out of line with what I've learned from a manager or a scientist. And in this particular project, my job was not to ask questions about the validity of knowledge, but just to kind of catalog and capture and understand what that knowledge looks like. I think really what that requires is getting scientists and fishermen in the room to talk to each other and kind of parse out why is it that you're seeing something that contradicts what I, as a scientist, understand, and what might be going on that is causing that kind of knowledge to be created.
Question in the room?
I think my question is kind of related to the last one. I was wondering, and maybe this is beyond the scope of your work, whether there is a literature effort going on as far as trying to validate local ecological knowledge and determine, does it line up with what scientists observe. And then I was thinking there's other ways you could imagine it
Mm-hmm.
feeding into science, like generating hypotheses. So you wouldn't just say, okay, this is knowledge, we'll apply it, but you'd say this is they're observing something, let's try other methods to look at that same relationship. I'm just curious how the two kind of different fields interact.
Yeah, so the question was kind of, are there studies or examples where fishermen's knowledge is kind of being validated with science, or whether the local ecological knowledge can be used to kind of generate hypotheses and research questions to explore further. Is that? Yeah. So I think for the first part, yes, there are definitely a number of published papers that are kind of looking at fishermen's knowledge in certain contexts and validating, so to speak, or comparing them with scientific information. I think the second piece is super important, and that was a big driver of this project, was what are fishermen seeing that we may not be realizing that we should be paying attention to, and may not be asking those questions. And so I've mentioned at the beginning, there's a cooperative research and development agreement between the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in the state of Maine that's just getting started and starting to think about ecosystem-based fisheries management in just eastern Maine in a really small context. And part of that, and part of this project incorporated into that kind of process, was what are some of the questions that we can be asking as we start to think about that shift towards EBFM, and how can fishermen inform those questions? So yeah, I think that's super important.
From Ross, how do fishermen react to your findings? Have you been able to communicate this work back to local fishermen, both in the study and more broadly?
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, I got the opportunity to go back up to Maine and present this work with the fishermen that I interviewed, and kind of get their feedback about how they thought it was useful and what to do with it. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. The folks that were able to come to the meeting were really positive and excited. I think they would like to see more. Their feedback was really, how can we get more people in the field talking to us, especially kind of at the state level.
Any more questions in the room?
When you were analyzing the cognitive maps, did you find any perceptions or beliefs or values that were really prevalent that shaped the different models that you were finding? Besides just the experiences.
So the question was whether, when I was analyzing the cognitive maps, if there were any sort of values that were shaping those maps. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Certainly, I didn't kind of key in on that per se. I think most people participate in the lobster fishery and are really dependent on that. And so a lot of people talked about how they're seeing cod coming back more than they have been in the past couple of years, and they're worried about that, even though maybe it's a good thing. And so there was a lot of kind of like, cod eat all of our lobster, or things like that are emphasized as based on kind of the value that they see economically, in particular in the fisheries they participate in. But yeah, I didn't look particularly kind of at value systems, but that obviously comes hugely into play.
Yeah, this is kind of related to the last one. I was thinking about you have the lobster fishermen up, and then you have next to that the chart with somebody who participated with 7 or so. So did you find there was a better sophistication of knowledge, assuming that one with 7 also participated in lobster? Did that person have a more sophisticated understanding, including, the relationship with the cod fishermen?
Yeah, I mean, only anecdotally I can say, repeating the question. So thinking about the individual who just fished lobster versus those who participated in a lot of other fisheries, including lobster, did they have a different understanding of the lobster fishery or relationships with lobster as a result? I think absolutely. Diversified fishermen definitely talked more about kind of the balance between different species than did fishermen who were targeting just one. And that's what they focused on. Yeah, I think part of that is seeing the give and take in different fisheries and seeing how one gear might affect another, or how depletion of sea urchins impacts kelp, things like that. And so being able to see those by participating in multiple fisheries changed the way people talked about those fisheries for sure.
I have a related question online from Clara. Is there a strong interest in diversification among fishermen in eastern Maine? Are specialized fishermen aware of their more narrow scope of the greater ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. The reason that the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is interested in diversification is because the fishermen, that's their biggest interest in that community, is how do we ensure that if lobster is not booming in 2 years, we still have fish and fisheries to have access to. So that's a huge concern, and especially among the young fishermen I spoke with. And anytime you attend a management meeting, the biggest concern is how can we get young people into more fisheries, because they're currently not able to do that. So yeah, that's huge.
Sorry, just following up on that, is that splintering of the permitting process, is that a management strategy to limit access and conserve fisheries, or?
No, it was never intended. So the question was whether that's the kind of splintering of the management, the licensing in Maine over time was meant to constrain access, or what it was for. It was super well-intended decisions to conserve different fisheries, basically, in response to changes in the ecosystem or the social system. Never meant to constrain access. That just was kind of the unintended consequence, one of the unintended consequences of that.
Any more questions?
Yeah, so you mentioned that something about age differentiation, like those who might be younger might only have experience with one fishery. And so as the fisheries management has gotten stovepiped, it seems like it's limited the scope of understanding for the ecosystem. And it seems like management is also to an extent stovepiped around different species. So I guess the question or comment is how do you see that changing as the agency itself and management starts moving towards this ecosystem-based model?
So if I understood the question, it was, there's been this constraining of access, but so fisheries are siloed, access is siloed, as is the management system. And as we start thinking about unsiloing that system, what will the knowledge kind of look like? Or
yeah, or do you see that changing as we're pushing forward this EBFM agenda and process? Do you see some of that stovepiping and knowledge and access to fisheries maybe changing?
I would hope so. Yeah. I mean, I think, so you mentioned age, and interestingly, I only talked to 17 people, so there are plenty of questions that I couldn't answer. Age was not significant in terms of scope of knowledge, which may just be because I talked to some young people who had really knowledgeable, observant fathers who taught them to fish. So kind of individual things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think if people have access to more fisheries, then they'll be able to observe more parts of the ecosystem. I don't think it's an easy shift. I don't see access opening up in the short term, even kind of as we shift towards EBFM. There are just so many factors in that process, but that would be great if there was a way to do it well.
A couple more questions online. What are the next steps for your findings?
So this was really a pilot project, and in the context of that EBFM pilot that's happening up in eastern Maine, hopefully some of this work will be expanded with a greater pool of fishermen, maybe asking more specific questions that can be relevant and applied to management, or kind of setting up a science framework for EBFM. So the next steps are to do more of this, but maybe more narrowed in.
And as follow-up, was there a paper published? Was a report published? And where can people find that?
Yeah, there's a paper that's forthcoming at some point in Ecology and Society that'll be out sometime, hopefully soon.
Any more questions in the room or online? If not, thank you all for coming and hearing in.